Hey, it's Dan. I'm frequently asked if home inspections and appraisals are the same thing, and they're not. But it gets confusing because on TV programs and in a number of conversations that I hear on the phone, I hear things like, well, when the home appraiser comes out to do their inspection. And well, then now they're using language that suggests they are the same thing. So let's take a couple minutes to take a quick look at how home inspections and appraisers are similar, and then perhaps more importantly, how they're different. So the first thing that the two have in common is that the vast majority of the time, the buyer pays. The buyer pays for their home inspection and they pay for the home appraisal. Sellers rarely get involved in either of those costs, especially the home inspection. Also, both inspectors and appraisers need to be licensed. So regardless of who's doing them, they should be properly trained and part of an association to make sure that you have at least good qualified people doing the work. Now, just like every other industry, including mine, there's a great deal of variety in terms of the quality and skills you get that come along with that license, but both home inspectors and appraisers need to be licensed to perform their duties for a fee. The last two things I'd say is that in each case, the parties are there to look out for the better interest of certain parties. We'll get into detail in that on how they're different, but the home inspector is there looking out for the buyer. The appraiser is there looking out for the lender, arguably the buyer a little bit, but really they're looking out for the lender. So each of them is there to try and assist in the due diligence periods for the variety of parties. And then the last thing that they have in common is that, contrary to popular opinion or popular belief, neither the home inspection nor the appraisal is required by law. Most buyers will have home inspections of a variety of kinds, which, by the way, we 100% support, but it's not required. And appraisals aren't required by law. Generally, the lender funding the loan requires the appraisal, but that's not a law. That's a business choice because they want some investigation done to determine whether or not this is a good loan for them to make. They want to know if your $600,000 sale is appropriate. Is the house worth $600,000? Or is it worth $600,000, but gosh, that big gaping hole in the roof is kind of a problem because that big gaping hole in the roof 2 years from now may mean the home is only worth $540,000, given the trouble about to come. So that's a brief overview of what they have in common. They're both very usual, very common, but they're not required. Buyer typically pays for both, and they are technically there to try and provide some sense of value to different parties. Okay, so how are they different? Well, one of the first things is the home inspector serves the buyer, and the appraiser really serves the lender. Now, a buyer gets to choose their home inspector. We recommend you only go with a home inspector that's recommended by your broker or by someone you know and trust who's worked with the inspector before. This is not a time for Google, Angie's List, or God forbid, Yelp. This is a time to get a good referral from someone you trust. Now, you don't get to choose your appraiser, so that's just a roll of the dice. But the appraiser that you choose is there to represent the buyer, and only the buyer. Technically, the inspection report is the business only of the buyer. Now, every buyer who works with a realtor, 99.9% of them anyway, will choose to share the report so they can go over it together. And if the buyer asks for repairs, they will perhaps have to share part of the report with the seller so the seller has evidence that there's a problem. But technically, the buyer and inspector have a private relationship that's really only between them because the buyer has asked the inspector to come out to the house, take a look, and educate the buyer on what's there, what possible maintenance or repair issues there are today, and what they can expect to come up in the future. And depending on the inspector, you also may see that the inspector can give opinions on the gravity of the situation. The first house I ever bought, which was my first experience with a home inspector, put all of his repairs in a red light, yellow light, green light color coding system. Red light meant, hey man, this needs to be taken care of ASAP. Yellow is more of like, you're going to want to get this taken care of, say in the next year or so, or definitely monitor it to make sure it doesn't get worse. And green light was sort of a, the doors really could use door stops, but it's not really going to impact the value or the safety of the house if you don't get them. You're just going to get little dings in the wall, right? So most inspectors don't literally use red light, yellow light, green light, but they may communicate to you in some way similar to that to let the buyer know, or you as a buyer, if you are one, that there's a severity and a hierarchy to the issues that are discovered. Some inspectors don't like to get into that, and the way they present their information is sort of, all of these are issues, you can decide for yourself. if there's any severity or priority difference. Again, the appraiser, on the other hand, is letting the lender know whether or not that $600,000 price is fair and whether or not there's any repairs that need to be made that could impact health and safety of the house itself or the people living or visiting there. They don't necessarily really care about all the repair items, but what are those that could cause a problem? Is there rot? Does the roof appear to be old? Do there appear to be unsafe electrical issues? Those they care about because those could lead to problems in the house that would devalue it, thus making it a less good investment for the bank to make. So who is served by the home inspector in the appraisal is generally different. You could argue that the appraiser is sort of there to look out for the buyer, but I would argue the buyer has other people to turn to for that. The appraiser is really there for the bank. Now, what they do while they're at the house is also going to be different. First of all, the home inspector is going to take a very in-depth look at the structure. The appraiser is going to do more of what I'd call a naked eye inspection of the house. They're not going to look at things in as great a detail. They're not going to go test all the plumbing fixtures, all the electrical outlets. They're not going to go check the pipes as well in the crawl space or go into the attic to look for open splices or open junction boxes. They're not going to walk the roof. It's going to be more of a naked eye inspection. So the depth is different. Also, while the buyer pays for both of them, the buyer is not really invited to join the appraiser at the house. The appraiser does their job, submits their report, the buyer gets to look at it. Whereas the home inspector, given that they work directly for the buyer, will invite the buyer to attend. Now, some inspectors like the buyer to be there the entire time. Some inspectors prefer the buyer only arrive at the end of the inspection for a summary to kind of go over everything. But either way, it's the buyer's right to be there the entire time for the home inspection. You could argue whether or not the buyer really has any right to be there during the appraisal. In addition to how in-depth their inspection will be, note that the home inspector is really only there to look at the physical structures on the house and perhaps driveways and walkways leading up to and around it. The home inspector is not really there to look at the neighborhood, the market, what's happening to the area in general. Is it on the up? Is it on the down? In other words, appreciation, depreciation, that's not the inspector's job. And they're not really there to tell you whether or not that $600 sale price is appropriate for that house. Some might lean into an opinion on that, but that's really not what they're there for. The appraiser, on the other hand, is not just looking at the structure. They're looking at the neighborhood, the area, what direction is it going, and does this seem like a good price given the direction of the neighborhood and the market. So again, physical structure on the inspection, structure and beyond on the appraisal. The last few things I'm going to kind of roll in together. I'm going to say tolerance, how much say, and impact each of these has on the purchase or sale of the house is really how they differ. See, for an appraiser, a leaky pipe might be deemed something that can hold up a sale, right? This $600,000 price seems fair, but that leaky pipe needs to be fixed prior to the close of escrow, prior to making the loan. Whereas to a home inspector, they don't really have a say in things like that. They may not even have an opinion. While they may give you a sense of severity of the issue, a home inspector may say, once you move in, you're going to want to fix the leaky pipe. Once you move in, you're going to start wanting to think about changing this line of electrical stuff because there's some janky work being done. A home inspector isn't necessarily recommending that you go through or don't go through with the sale without repairs. The appraiser, on the other hand, will do that. An inspector is there to give you an opinion, maybe some judgment. The appraiser, frankly, is there to be probably more judgmental than your relatives at Thanksgiving dinner. So what impact they can have on the sale then is different because the home inspector is just going to give you an opinion and a report, but the buyer and seller, buyer really, and their agent together are going to decide what to do with that information. Technically, they can do nothing. They can say, great, there it is. I'm not changing any requests or any terms of the sale. Or they may say, I'm out. I don't even want to discuss it. What came up in that report is enough for me to walk. Or, as is most commonly the case, buyer says, I'm going to the seller and there's a few things that either need to be fixed or that I need to be compensated for as a buyer if we're going to move forward. But the inspector doesn't really give anything out that directly impacts the sale. The appraiser, however, when they issue their appraisal report, does, because your $600,000 contract has to be matched by a $600,000 estimate by the appraiser. If it's low, you have a problem on your hands, either in negotiation with the buyer or seller, or among the buyers and sellers, or You have to contest it and show the appraiser that they're wrong. And let's be frank, appraisers are people. I recently had a home sell in a part of Portland where the first appraisal came back at 517 and the second one came back at 550. Nothing changed other than the appraiser in about 4 weeks of time, which I assure you did not change the market that much. So you can come into issues with the appraiser. They have power. I've had appraisers say, we need smoke alarms, carbon monoxide, we need proof that the roof is good. Recently had an appraiser call out sloping floors and say they needed to be leveled. That was the first time in 16 years. And then another appraiser came out, said absolutely nothing about them. So appraisers have a lot of power. Inspectors technically don't. You hire them, or a buyer hires them, for their opinion, which is valuable, and maybe some recommendations on repairs, and again, a recommendation as to severity or time frames in which to address something. But the inspector does not have any direct influence on the purchase and sale of a home. The appraiser, on the other hand, does. Well, that's a quick or not so quick look at what appraisals and inspections have in common, and again, how they differ. Inspections come first. The last thing we should note, you don't typically order your appraisal until you're through your inspections and know that the buyer is going forward and wishes to move ahead with the purchase of the house. Because once the appraiser has signed on and is going to the home, the buyer gets charged that fee and they do not get it back once the appraiser has gone out. So you don't want to be in a situation where the buyer pays $800 for an appraisal and backs out because of the inspection results. So if you have any further questions, reach out anytime and we look forward to talking to you soon.